If you want to destroy a narcissist's ego, you don't attack them. You remove what feeds them, because the fastest way to destabilize grandiosity isn't rage, it's strategic indifference. And today, I'm going to explain exactly why. If you've ever wondered why some people seem completely unfazed by narcissists while others get trapped in endless conflict, stay with me, because the difference lies in these 6 strategies. Narcissistic confidence is often a carefully constructed mask that conceals deep-seated insecurity. On the surface, they appear self-assured, dominant, and invulnerable. But beneath that veneer is a fragile self that is highly sensitive to threats, criticism, or loss of control. Their grandiosity functions as a psychological shield, protecting them from feelings of inadequacy or unworthiness that they rarely acknowledge openly. This fragility means that their apparent strength is dependent on external validation, admiration, and the perception of superiority over others. Even minor challenges to their authority, independence, or self-image can provoke intense internal discomfort because it threatens the very structure that maintains their confidence. The more they are confronted with situations where they are not in control or where their superiority is questioned, the more vulnerable they feel, even if they outwardly respond with aggression, charm, or dismissal. Understanding this fragility is critical because it explains why strategies that undermine their ego do not require direct attack. They exploit the instability underlying the grandiose facade. By recognizing that narcissistic self-assurance is contingent rather than intrinsic, one can anticipate how they will react to indifference, accountability, or non-validation. Their ego is not a solid, self-sustaining entity. It is a delicate system that relies on constant reinforcement. Once that reinforcement is removed or challenged, the protective mask falters, revealing the insecurity that motivates much of their behavior. In essence, beneath the confident exterior lies a psychological vulnerability that, when understood and approached strategically, can be subtly destabilized without overt confrontation. A narcissist's ego relies heavily on control, and this dependence is a core vulnerability. Control functions as psychological oxygen for them. It is what sustains their sense of power, importance, and self-worth. In relationships, conversations, and social dynamics, they constantly seek to dominate, influence, and manipulate in order to confirm that they are the central figure and that others are subordinate. When they perceive a loss of control, even subtly, it triggers anxiety, frustration, and an underlying fear of inadequacy. Their grandiose confidence masks this dependence, but it cannot eliminate it. They need to feel that situations, people, and outcomes bend to their desires in order to maintain the narrative of superiority. Even when outwardly calm or charming, their internal sense of stability is tightly tied to the illusion of control. This reliance makes them predictable in certain ways. They respond to challenges or disruptions with defensive aggression, manipulation, or attempts to reassert dominance. Understanding this dependency is critical for anyone seeking to neutralize their ego because it reveals that their power is conditional, not absolute. Strategies that reduce or remove their ability to control interactions, reactions, or perceptions strike at the very foundation of their self-esteem. Whether through emotional neutrality, enforced boundaries, or refusal to engage in their power games, undermining control destabilizes the fragile equilibrium they work tirelessly to maintain. Their outward confidence may remain, but internally, the lack of influence creates tension, uncertainty, and vulnerability, which is where the narcissist is most susceptible to psychological disruption. A narcissist's ego survives on validation and admiration, and withholding it can strike at the heart of their grandiosity. They have an almost insatiable need to be seen as exceptional, superior, and worthy of praise, and they constantly scan their environment for confirmation of these beliefs. Every compliment, every acknowledgement, every sign of approval functions as psychological fuel that reinforces their inflated self-image. When this admiration is removed or proportioned realistically rather than exaggerated, it deprives them of the energy that sustains their sense of superiority. They may attempt to provoke, charm, or manipulate to regain that validation. But if these efforts are met with neutrality or calm refusal, the absence of reinforcement begins to destabilize their internal narrative. It is important to understand that this need is not about genuine appreciation. It is a mechanism to regulate their fragile self-esteem. Without external affirmation, they are forced to confront gaps in their self-perception that they usually avoid. Over time, consistent non-validation erodes the illusion of omnipotence and invulnerability, creating frustration, anxiety, and a heightened awareness of their limitations. Refusing to inflate their self-image or provide excessive praise does not need to be confrontational. It is the quiet withdrawal of psychological support that is most effective. In essence, the narcissist's reliance on admiration makes their ego highly vulnerable to subtle, strategic deprivation, and the absence of validation exposes the insecurity lurking beneath their confident, grandiose exterior. When a narcissist encounters firm boundaries, it directly challenges their assumed entitlement and undermines their sense of control. They operate under the belief that others should conform to their desires, accommodate their needs, and react in ways that reinforce their superiority. Boundaries disrupt this expectation, signaling that their influence has limits and that their dominance is not absolute. Even when presented calmly and consistently, clear limits provoke internal tension, because the narcissist is forced to confront the reality that they cannot manipulate or coerce at will. Boundaries are powerful not because they are aggressive, but because they are consistent and non-negotiable. They communicate that your autonomy is inviolable. This consistency frustrates attempts to assert control, eroding their sense of authority and destabilizing the ego they carefully protect. Over time, repeated enforcement of boundaries signals to the narcissist that their previous strategies of entitlement and manipulation are ineffective, creating cognitive dissonance between their perception of invulnerability and the reality of limitation. The effect is subtle, yet profound. The narcissist experiences heightened insecurity and obsessive attention as they try to navigate a social environment where their influence is no longer guaranteed. Clear boundaries do not need to provoke confrontation or anger. Their mere presence quietly undermines the psychological framework that sustains narcissistic grandiosity. By asserting limits and refusing to yield to coercion or manipulation, you challenge the narrative they rely on to maintain superiority, forcing the fragile ego to reckon with a reality it cannot control. When a narcissist is held publicly accountable, it threatens the carefully curated image they depend on to maintain superiority. Their sense of self is not just built on internal beliefs, it is reinforced by how others perceive them. They spend considerable energy managing impressions, crafting narratives, and ensuring that they appear competent, admired, and untouchable. When discrepancies between their projected persona and actual behavior are exposed, especially in front of others, it undermines their authority and shatters the illusion of flawless control. This exposure can provoke anxiety, defensiveness, or attempts to redirect blame, because the narcissist cannot tolerate evidence that challenges the story they present to the world. Accountability doesn't need to be confrontational or aggressive. Even calm, factual acknowledgement of inconsistencies or consequences can disrupt their ego. The public nature of accountability intensifies the effect because it introduces social scrutiny, which is one of their primary sources of reinforcement. Unlike private interactions where manipulation may succeed, visibility removes the ability to rewrite reality without consequence. Over time, consistent accountability erodes their confidence and forces them to confront the limits of their influence. In essence, narcissists thrive on the perception that they are always competent, admired, and unchallenged. When accountability pierces this illusion, it destabilizes the ego by revealing vulnerability, incompetence, or hypocrisy. It exposes a reality that contradicts their narrative of invincibility, making it one of the most effective ways to subtly weaken the psychological structure that sustains their grandiosity. When a narcissist observes someone thriving independently, it directly threatens the narrative of indispensability they rely on to maintain superiority. Their ego thrives on the perception that they are central, controlling, and essential to the success or happiness of those around them. When you demonstrate competence, emotional stability, and fulfillment without reliance on them, it contradicts their internal story that they are the most important figure in your life. This independence acts as evidence that their influence was never absolute, challenging the illusion of control and superiority they cling to. Unlike direct confrontation or criticism, thriving quietly and confidently is a subtle yet powerful form of destabilization because it cannot be countered with aggression or manipulation. It forces the narcissist to internally reconcile the reality that they were not necessary for your achievements or well-being, highlighting the limitations of their authority. Each example of self-sufficiency, personal growth, or success amplifies the discrepancy between their imagined dominance and the reality of your autonomy. Over time, this sustained demonstration of independence creates cognitive tension, frustration, and even obsessive attention as they attempt to mentally process what they cannot control. The paradox is that the more you live freely and successfully, the more your actions silently violently undermine their ego. Thriving independently is not about showing off or seeking to provoke. It is about reclaiming autonomy in a way that exposes the fragility of narcissistic grandiosity and reduces the psychological leverage they once held. When a narcissist faces calm, measured accountability, it creates tension because it removes their ability to manipulate perception and evade responsibility. Their self-image depends heavily on maintaining the illusion of infallibility and superiority, and when they are held accountable, even subtly or factually, it exposes contradictions in their narrative. Unlike emotional confrontation, which can be dismissed as overreaction or misinterpretation, calm accountability is difficult to deflect because it is grounded in reason and consistency. It undermines the carefully crafted persona they rely on to project dominance and competence. Accountability forces them to acknowledge, at least internally, that their behavior has limits and consequences, challenging the sense of omnipotence they work to uphold. Social awareness amplifies this effect, as narcissists are acutely sensitive to how others perceive them. The more public the acknowledgement, the more it threatens their constructed reputation. Over time, repeated accountability destabilizes their ego by highlighting discrepancies between their projected image and reality, creating internal discomfort, cognitive dissonance, and frustration. They may respond with defensiveness, projection, or attempts to regain control, but the underlying effect remains. Their narrative of superiority is subtly undermined. In essence, calm accountability exposes the fragile dependency on perception and control that sustains narcissistic self-esteem, quietly eroding the power dynamics they attempt to enforce while leaving the observer in a position of psychological strength. When a narcissist encounters calm detachment, it exposes the emotional dependence that underpins their grandiosity. Their ego thrives on eliciting reactions, anger, fear, admiration, or anxiety from those around them, using these responses as proof of influence and superiority. When you respond instead with emotional regulation, composure, and indifference, you remove the fuel that sustains their inflated self-perception. Without the reactions they crave, their attempts at manipulation or provocation lose potency, and the carefully constructed sense of dominance begins to unravel. Calm detachment communicates that their tactics no longer control or unsettle you, which directly threatens the narrative they rely on to feel powerful. Over time, your consistent emotional stability forces them to confront a reality they cannot dominate: your independence from their psychological games. This exposure can create frustration, obsession, and even subtle anxiety because it reveals the fragility of the very ego they work to protect. Unlike confrontation or verbal attack, calm detachment is effective precisely because it is non-reactive. It doesn't escalate conflict or feed their need for attention. Instead, it quietly demonstrates that their influence is limited and that their ego requires external reinforcement to survive. In essence, when you maintain composure and distance in the face of provocation, you reveal the emotional dependence hidden beneath narcissistic grandiosity, destabilizing their sense of control and superiority while asserting your own psychological autonomy. Destroying a narcissist's ego is not about cruelty or revenge. It's about strategically removing the psychological fuel that sustains it. Their grandiosity, confidence, and apparent dominance are built on external validation, control, and emotional reactions from others. When these resources are withheld, the carefully constructed facade begins to crack. Indifference, firm boundaries, refusal to over-validate, thriving independently, calm accountability, and emotional regulation all work together to expose the fragility beneath the surface. Each strategy quietly undermines the assumptions of entitlement, invulnerability, and centrality that narcissists rely on. They cannot tolerate a world in which they are not the center, and when attention, compliance, or admiration is withdrawn, their ego struggles to maintain coherence. The paradox is that the more detached, self-assured, and consistent you are, the more destabilized their internal world becomes, without any direct confrontation. These approaches do not rely on anger or provocation. They rely on understanding how narcissistic self-esteem functions and using that knowledge to quietly dismantle it. In effect, by protecting your autonomy and refusing to feed the ego they depend on, you create the most powerful disruption, the slow, inevitable collapse of their self-perceived superiority, leaving them to face the reality of their limitations and dependence.